Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We have a very exciting talk for you all, and exciting things are happening here at Angelo State, especially in the College of the Arts and Humanities. The Lone Star Lecture Series is the premier annual event of the Dr. Arnaldo de Leon Department of History at Angelo State and is supported by the Dorsey B. Hardiman Endowed Chair in History. This lecture series hosts scholars of Texas history to deliver a keynote address coinciding with the anniversary of Texas independence in March of each year. But intentionally, topics can be wide-ranging and cover anything related to Texas history at all. For example, last year, our first Lone Star Lecture Series address was delivered by Don Frazier of Schreiner University on Texas in the Civil War. So we're happy to have you all. We also had an email sign-in sheet by the refreshments, so particularly those of the community that are not ASU students or faculty. If you'd like to learn about next year's event, we'll shoot you an email once we know the date and time of that. Likewise, for our ASU students, we are kicking off an ethnic studies minor. Really excited to begin that in the fall. So there's a flyer informational about that, and talks and subjects like the one you're going to be learning about would be prime to learn more about with that minor. Well, now I'd like to introduce the Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, Dr. John Klingeman, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Good evening, buenas tardes. How's everybody doing tonight? Good? Well, it certainly is a pleasure to introduce someone that I consider a very dear friend and someone that I consider to be, headed towards becoming probably one of the best scholars of Mexican-American history in the borderlands. About 15, 16 years ago, we met at a conference. And we had both just come out of graduate school. We were assistant professors, and of course, we've taken different routes. I'm the mean old dean, and of course now, and he's an assistant professor, associate professor at Texas Tech in the Department of History. And he's also the program coordinator of Mexican American and Latino Studies. And over the course of our career, we've stayed in touch. We've had joint projects together here and at Texas Tech, and I recall going to Texas Tech where we had a conference on violence in the borderlands. And at that time, the three of us took a photo, myself, Dr. Levario, and Dr. De Leon. And we haven't changed much 15, 16 years later. We still look the same because we just took the same photo and my wife showed me and I thought, yeah, we look the same. Well, what can I say? Yeah, Dr. Levario, I consider one of the best scholars of the U.S.-Mexico border and the experiences of Mexican Americans. And of course, we had probably the greatest example here, and for both of us, a mentor in Dr. Arnaldo de Leon, who set the standard, because here at Angelo State University, you had someone who really contributed to the construction of an entire field of study of Mexican American history, and that's Dr. de Leon. So we had a shining example to follow. So a little bit about Dr. Levario. He graduated from the University of Texas. He attended Stanford University and also graduated from the University of Notre Dame. And, his first book, Militarizing the Border When Mexicans Became the Enemy, is an absolute, just dynamic book that is a critical examination of the experiences of Mexican Americans along the U.S.-Mexico border. And he really dove into so many of the events that took place along the border. Right now, his current manuscript is actually The Outliers, Paseños in the Borderlands, which, again, it's something that is built upon his previous work, so I'm really excited to see what that will bring for us in the future. And he's also a part right now of the Texas Academic Leadership Academy, which is something relatively new for people and academics in the state of Texas that can participate in. And at one point, maybe jump into administration, so you may be making that shift at some point. So please help me welcome Dr. Miguel Levario.
Well, good evening, and thank you, John, for that amazing introduction. I'm about to hire him as my PR person, and next time I go on my book tour. No, I want to thank you all and thank you all for the warm welcome and the opportunity to speak to you all at this amazing university. I want to thank Angelo State, the College of Arts and Humanities, Doctors Michael Powers, Jason Pierce, John Klingeman, and the Dr. Arnoldo de Leon Department of History. I sincerely appreciate each of you and your support in bringing me here. You have been nothing but gracious and generous with your time. This has been by far the best experience I've had when I've been welcomed to a university. So don't tell the other universities that, but this is by far the best. And I do want to acknowledge Dr. De Leon. As John had hinted, Dr. De Leon is not only sort of part of the canon of Mexican-American history, but he's also a tremendous mentor. As a scholar, an early career scholar, he invited me and John and several others to contribute to his edited volume, War Along the Borderlands. And for somebody at that stage in his career, it was an amazing invitation and certainly helped me to continue on the path of scholarship. So I wanted to take this time to thank Dr. De Leon for being such an incredible mentor and quite a great example for us scholars. So thank you. All right. Maybe we can get that PowerPoint up. One of my best pictures. That's why I always use it. That was taken a few years ago, so a little less hair this time around. I'm a little bit grayer. The borderland is a byproduct of an enforced perception of static nation states or identities slamming against one another. However, the reality of the borderlands is far less neat and dichotomous. It is a region and community. The region and community evokes an identity and functionality separate from the interior centers of power. Borderlands historian Oscar Martinez argued, quote, by nature, border zones, especially those that are far removed from the core, spawn independence, rebellion, cultural deviation, disorder, and even lawlessness. The history of countless nations illustrates how borderland regions frequently depart from the norms of interior zones and how they develop institutional patterns and interests quite separate from those of the centers of power, end quote. Borderland Studies seeks to understand this paradoxical position of static and fluidity. The inherent nature of the borderlands is movement and accommodation in what Martinez called disorder. Because borderlands function in such a manner, the region and its inhabitants can be seen as a threat to the rigid notions of the state and nationalism. Let me step back a bit and give you my background and the context of my talk today. I was born in El Paso, Texas, but grew up in a town split between two states called Anthony. Half the town is in New Mexico and the other is in Texas. I grew up on the Texas side. I went to high school in downtown El Paso, not far from where this picture was taken. This is looking from the Sun Bowl of the University of Texas at El Paso. And what you'll see on this side is Juarez. This is I-10, and this is El Paso. Right? So I went to high school in downtown El Paso, and depending on which direction one takes, you are only a couple of miles or so from the international boundary. I am a product of the borderlands. The borderlands are who I am, and it's what I've made my life's work about. I opened my book, Militarizing the Border When Mexicans Became the Enemy, with a vivid memory of the daily 20-mile drive to school from Anthony to El Paso. My brothers and I attended a small, all-male Catholic high school nestled in the downtown district. One morning, as we approached the stretch of highway that hugs the University of Texas at El Paso, I noticed that the city was preparing for war. Perhaps a war not in the traditional sense, but a war nonetheless, as a long line of Border Patrol trucks had positioned themselves side by side along the banks of the Rio Grande to guard against what some people called an immigrant invasion. This was 1993, and the El Paso Border Patrol Sector Chief, Sylvester Reyes, initiated Operation Blockade, later renamed Operation Hold the Line. The strategy called for border agents to stand watch at the boundary line to deter immigrants from crossing illegally into the country. I was confused, incensed, and indignant, but I shelved those feelings as we found our usual parking spot in front of the Stanton Street entrance of Cathedral High School. I never forgot the sight of that standoff as we made our daily journey to school and morning. It reminded me that ethnic Mexicans, a term I use to refer to both U.S. citizens of Mexican descent and Mexican nationals who reside in the United States, they are not just racialized others, but are perceived as enemies of the state. The conflict of the nation state in imposing its will that borders are fixed results in the categorization of ethnic Mexicans as enemies of the state rather than just racialized others. Militarizing the border examines the conflictual context of West Texas and northern Chihuahua to understand race relations in the borderlands during the early decades of the 20th century. A review of the events, including the Mexican Revolution and the setting, acts as a lens through which the complex struggle between authorities, the populace, and the underlying racial tones of conflict may be understood. For example, a case study I discuss in the book is the Santa Isabel massacre and the subsequent El Paso race riot of 1916. The dramatic shift in racial demographics and economic hardships caused by rapid population growth, due in large part to the events related to the Mexican Revolution, affected race relations between Anglos and Mexicans in El Paso. By 1916, the ethnic Mexican population of El Paso outnumbered that of whites, emerging as the majority population in the city. This is especially significant because it is the first time that the Mexican-American community is separated in the US Census. That will become nationwide in 1930 census, but this is in 1916. Woodrow Wilson ordered that census to gauge what he thought would be a potential danger to the city if Pancho Villa should ever give some kind of order of attack. So that's what led to that particular census. By 1916, El Paso's Mexicanization in the early decades of the 20th century contributed to strong racial tensions between the city's Anglo population and the growing Mexican population. The influx of refugees and displaced laborers from Mexico resulted in heated discussion regarding Mexican immigrants among Anglo laborers and residents. In the closing months of 1915, diplomatic and political tensions escalated with the dramatic shift in power within Mexico as Mexican revolutionary leader Francisco Pancho Villa's power had waned. Events in the northern Mexican border state of Chihuahua acted as a major source of uneasiness among Mexicans and Anglos in the city of El Paso. Since the onset of hostilities, the Ciudad Juárez-El Paso region was a critical stronghold for revolutionary activity, transporting goods and ammunition, recruitment, and financial support for various factions. The events demonstrate how diplomatic and military struggles between the United States and Mexican revolutionary agents resulted in the arbitrary categorization of the Mexican population along the border as the, quote, non-white other, or specifically the enemy other. The classification became evident as local, state, and federal authorities mobilized, identified, and contained the Mexican population as oppositional to, quote, Americans in the late 19th and early 20th century. This process has continued to the present day as militarization efforts have been revamped and intensified since the 1990s, and especially since the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. Recently, I published an essay in the edited volume Border Policing, A History of Enforcement and Evasion in North America, that examines the history of organized vigilante violence along the US-Mexico border at the turn of the 20th century. More specifically, I looked at how vigilantes operated and functioned under the auspice of the state to intimidate, assault, and remove ethnic Mexicans from the socio-political fold. For example, in the wake of the Mexican Revolution of 1910, and more specifically, the United States occupation of Veracruz, Mexico in 1914, Home Guards formed in Texas and in other parts of U.S.-Mexico borderlands. Many Anglo-Texans formed home guards to defend themselves from a perceived Mexican threat represented by demographic shifts, mobilized political organizations, diplomatic tensions, and refugee migration. Most home guards were along or near the border, but several others were organized hundreds of miles away from the international boundary, like Wichita Falls, Texas, which is approximately 400 miles from the US-Mexico border. There was also another one in Beaumont, Texas. The governor and adjutant general's support of vigilante home guards snubbed law enforcement and federal officials' pleas for citizens not to resort to vigilantism and extra-legal activity. The governor directly avoided legitimizing home guards with legal recognition and structure. Regardless, home guards and the governor's office antagonized ethnic Mexicans, labeling them as enemies of the state with impunity. Scholars suggest that some Texas residents in the early 20th century straddled the line of maintaining order through legal means and violently securing justice through extra legal methods. For home guards, violence towards ethnic Mexicans was a matter of defending the country from a perceived internal and external enemy. A preliminary assessment suggests that many in the United States border region felt threatened by the Mexican population in their towns and their politicization during the first half of the 20th century. One example I came across in my research at the state archives, as letters were being sent to Governor Oscar Colquitt and their request to fight for the United States against Mexico because of the Veracruz situation, they often evoked, remember the Alamo. They often evoked those certain phrases of Texas nationalism in these particular letters. It was quite interesting to see. And the other aspect I want to talk about is that when there's another letter that simply stated that we need a home guard, and I forgot which town it was. And they said, we need a home guard here because I noticed after church a group of Mexicans speaking softly and in Spanish. That's all it took. That's all he said. And he also mentioned he didn't speak Spanish. So they could have been talking about tamales and he wouldn't know the difference. My working hypothesis suggests that armed civilians supported by the state agitated race relations and reinforced notions of nationalism while establishing a culture of violence that redefined the social, nationalist, and political structures along the US-Mexico boundary. The project also explains how race and ideas of nationalism were tied to the special relations between communities and border activity. This study augments the understanding of present-day ramifications of past borderland experiences, especially as organized vigilantism continues to rise in the wake of seemingly inefficient law enforcement and authority figures along the US-Mexico borderlands in the 21st century. In my first book, I outlined the trajectory of events like the Mexican Revolution of 1910, World War I, and Prohibition that provided the context of increased militarization of the southern border to a perceived Mexican attack across the border and from within. In my current project, I tentatively argue that as the political context since the Cold War and through the 21st century intensified, the US-Mexico borderlands were no longer a local issue as it was perceived in the earlier half of the 20th century, but rather a national problem. Changing political waves transformed Mexican migration and border residents of Mexican descent to enemies of the state and an immediate threat to the United States. The age-long perception of immigrants bringing crime, disease, violence, etc., evolves at the southern border where Mexicans are defamed and considered as national security threats and not just racialized others. The case study of the murder of Ezequiel Hernandez Jr. in Redford, Texas, is one of a string of examples of where the presence of Mexicans and Mexican Americans along the US side of the border are criminalized and vilified. Hernandez and Redford demonstrate the transformative power of the borderlands and the consequences suffered by the residents of Mexican descent. On May 17th, 1997, Ezequiel Hernandez Jr., an 18-year-old high school student who was herding his family goats, was murdered by a small team of U.S. Marines on an anti-drug mission along the U.S.-Mexico border. Redford, Texas, with a population of nearly 100 persons, was described in 1997 by United States Marine Corps Staff Sergeant Darren Dubray of Joint Task Force 6 as an unfriendly town and was considered a major crossing point and hub for drug smugglers. With little more than a refresher boot camp training session, the Marines were told they were entering a hostile environment and needed to follow the rules of engagement. Little to no law enforcement training was given to the Marines prior to their anti-drug surveillance mission. Hernandez's murder was not exclusively the result of a mission gone awry, but decades of defaming Mexican migrants and border residents as enemies of the state. Place. What is place? It can be a home, it can be a space for work, it can be a space for play. It could be anything we want it to be. Place is transformative and fluid. Yes, it does have rigid, stationary, and tangible characteristics like dirt, plants, shrubs, walls, fences, etc. The U.S.-Mexico border region, defined by the La Paz Agreement in 1983, is made up of two nations, 44 counties in the United States and 94 Mexican municipalities. Approximately 7.5 million inhabitants call the border region home. However, despite this rigid definition of the border for its inhabitants and the curious, the border can be many things. For anthropologist Carlos Duarte Herrera, an attempt to define the border is inherently flawed. Quote, first, its complexity makes it impossible to describe. Second, because it changes through time. And third, because it has different meaning to and is differently experienced by diverse social actors, including scholars, end quote. Mexican-born fronterizo writer Luis Humberto Crosthwaite described the border more abstractly, quote, like my girlfriend. There are girlfriends we are boastful about, and there are girlfriends we guard like an expensive secret, end quote. I'm still trying to figure out what that means, but I thought it was an interesting quote. Because it is a place of mystery, and that's why I used it, because it is mysterious, right? Subtlety, curiosity, and danger. It may be everything and nothing, but it is transformative, fluid, and ever-changing. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, identifies the border as a place to quote, keep terrorists and their weapons from entering the United States while welcoming legitimate travelers and commerce, end quote. A typical day at the border, according to the DHS, consists of conducting apprehensions, arrests, and refusals of inadmissible persons, and seizures of illegal narcotics, illicit currency, and products of intellectual property rights violations, all in a day's work. The contrasting views of the border region suggest an ever-changing landscape that is in part highly politicized. Although scapegoating immigrants is nothing new in United States history, it is, however, a weaponized tactic used against people of Mexican and Latin American descent to further alienate, racialize, and defame them as enemies of the state. The border is as much transformative as it is thought to be rigid. Security-based policies, increased militarization, and sophisticated security infrastructures project a fixed border that can be controlled at will. However, the clash between migration from Mexico and Latin America, transborder commerce, and the changing tides of the political context transformed the border from a site of interaction and exchange to a politically weaponized, militarized zone that yields to the castigation of its Latino residents and migrants as nemesis of the state. Increased militarization and harsher immigration and security policies over the course of the 20th and early 21st centuries hardened the belief that Mexicans and Latino immigrants are threats to the national security and fabric of the United States. Escalating political pressure and rhetoric regarding the conflated issues of border security, increased migration rates since the early decades of the 20th century, and shifting political circumstances such as the Cold War, the war on drugs, and the war on terror, hardened the idea that ethnic Mexicans were a threat to the nation and needed to be removed, denied entry, incarcerated, or at times killed. Since the Cold War, Mexican and Mexican Americans have been categorically labeled as enemies and threats to the state. Whether it is the Eisenhower administration stressing the possibility that Mexican immigrants can deliver and detonate an atomic bomb on US soil simply by crossing the Rio Grande River. There was a public service announcement issued by the Federal Bureau of Investigation stating, and I'm paraphrasing, be aware of that poor-looking immigrant crossing the river in a tattered suit and suitcase because he may contain what's known as a suitcase bomb. Now, I've been able to do some research and looking at the memos of the Eisenhower administration, and it was simply a thought that his advisors had because they were under the belief that the Soviets were producing so many nuclear weapons that they could potentially produce a mobile and small device. But there was absolutely no evidence of that. And of course, looking back, there was absolutely no evidence at that time that they could construct such a bomb. But it didn't matter. It was the threat of it, right? Or President George W. Bush, in the aftermath of 9/11, signed into law the Secure Fence Act in 2006 that greatly militarizes the southern border, despite that the terrorists responsible for the attacks in New York City, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania did not enter through the southern border or reside in the U.S. Southwest. For Hernandez, a high school student, to be transformed as a drug trafficker, or for military or law enforcement officers to lump immigrants or residents of Mexican descent with terrorists, is a result of historical legacies stretching back decades that shifted ethnic Mexicans from a racialized other to an enemy of the state. In my scholarship, I reviewed the events of the early 20th century, such as the Revolution and Prohibition, to argue that the state's presence along the border shaped and reinforced the identity of Mexicans as an enemy that must be subdued, lest their presence undermine the social, political, and cultural fabric of white America. In the first 3 decades of the 20th century, the state increased militarization efforts, such as creating the Border Patrol, mobilizing the National Guard, and authorizing vigilante groups like Home Guards to organize and act with impunity, synthesizing Mexicans as a threat to American society and Anglo hegemony. In the second half of the 20th century, as the political climate changed and its vulnerability to attack by its enemies dominated the political rhetoric, and the focus on the threat of Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans evolved. By labeling Mexicans as enemies or threats to the state, a high school student herding his family goats near his home is transformed into a menacing drug trafficker and enemy of the state by U.S. government and its so-called war on drugs. Before that fateful evening in May 1997, we must dive into the context and political firestorm that brought the U.S. military to the southern border in the 1990s. On September 5th, 1989, then President George H.W. Bush went on national television and held up a bag of crack cocaine and called drugs, quote, the gravest domestic threat facing our nation, end quote. To address this grave threat, the Bush administration would establish Joint Task Force 6, or JTF 6, headquartered in El Paso, Texas, to serve as the planning and coordinating operational headquarters to support local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies within the Southwest region to counter the flow of illegal drugs into the United States, end quote. In addition, the Bush administration implemented an aggressive and punitive approach to hopefully reduce and ultimately eliminate illicit drug use. President Bush pushed for a $7.9 billion war chest to combat narcotics and emphasize harsher penalties for users and more money for prisons, treatment programs, education, and prevention. The Pentagon's anti-narcotics budget increased by 100,000% between 1980 to 1992. As a result, the U.S. prison population nearly tripled between 1988 and 2008. When Bill Clinton won the presidency in 1992, he led a tough on crime initiative and explained to some degree expanded to some degree the anti-drug efforts of his predecessors. Between 1993 and 1997, President Bill Clinton's first term in office, the enforcement budget of the now defunct Immigration and Naturalization Service increased by 100%. In 1995, more than 8,000 active duty and reserve soldiers, sailors, and Air Force personnel, a force equivalent to an infantry division, participated in 754 counter-drug support missions on U.S. soil that led to nearly 1,900 arrests. Ezequiel Hernandez Jr.'s fate was sealed in 1996 when the Border Patrol Sector Headquarters in Marfa, Texas, petitioned JTF-6 to aid in anti-drug operations in West Texas. Now I'm gonna have to stop there just for a second because ever since I arrived in Lubbock 15 years ago, the concept of West Texas has been greatly complicated. And for somebody who's from El Paso and moving to Lubbock where they say this is West Texas is wondering how. Because I asked people there, what do you call the 350 miles west of here? Oh, far West Texas. Like, there's no far West Texas. That's just West Texas. You're the Panhandle according to our perspective. Don't ever say that to a Lubbockite that they're part of the Panhandle. And then we had that discussion today, as they say here in San Angelo, it's West Texas. Like, well, that's a whole other bag of marshmallows. Marfa was the most rural and least active of the 9 Border Patrol sectors along the U.S.-Mexico border. The request was approved by Operation Alliance, JTF-6 civilian sister agency, and the El Paso Task Force issued a call for military volunteers. The California-based 1st Marine Expeditionary Force signed on for the mission. Prior to their arrival to Redford, the unit participated in 119 missions with 28 operations scheduled for 1997 alone. The members of Team 7 were Team Leader Corporal Clemente Banuelos, Corporal Roy Torres Jr., Lance Corporal Ronald Wheeler Jr., and Lance Corporal James M. Blood. However, despite having conducted numerous operations, the U.S. Marines of Team 7 assigned to Redford, Texas, claimed that they didn't recall any individual team training done at Marfa prior to their insertion in the field. According to Corporal Torres, he received about 1 month of training for the JTF-6 mission, most of which was what he called a refresher course on things that we had been taught in basic training. As part of their standard military training, Marines were informed of the, quote, Joint Chief of Staff Standing Rules of Engagement. The rules of engagement dictate that when a soldier perceives an imminent threat to the lives of his fellow soldiers, he responds not as a police officer should, with a warning or with intent to disarm or wound, but instead as a warrior would on a battlefield. Marine Colonel Thomas Kelly explained just 2 days after Hernandez's death that, quote, if you reach the point where you fire for fear of your lives, then you usually fire to kill. On May 15th, 16 Marines were sent to their listening post and observation post mission in the Redford area called El Polvo, and rotate every few days with other soldiers. JTF-6 and the Border Patrol relayed intelligence that the area was a center for drug trafficking where 70 to 75% of the roughly 100 residents were involved in the illicit drug trade. Not even the most dangerous place in the world do you have 75% of its population criminal. But that's the intelligence they received. With the exception of, I guess, babies that were not involved in the drug trade. Staff Sergeant Darren Dubray warned the soldiers that drug smugglers posed an organized, sophisticated, and dangerous enemy, end quote. He alleged that other teams had taken fire on previous missions and the enemy would employ armed lookouts, and that some villagers were in cahoots with the smugglers, making Redford not a friendly town. The intelligence shared with the Marines contradicts the federal data regarding drug smuggling at the time. more than 85% of all illegal drugs enter the United States via official ports of entry, monitored by the Customs Service. According to a drug cartel member interviewed by border scholar Tony Payan in Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico, quote, cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamines are too valuable to risk crossing between ports of entries in the wilderness. They can be intercepted by a Border Patrol agent, and the loss to the organization would be considerable, end quote. In the early summer of 1996, Border Patrol Assistant Chief Patrol Agent David Castañeda was notified by informants that a trafficker named El Cubano was recruiting mule trains to smuggle upwards to 200 pounds of marijuana in backpacks across El Polvo. The operation was small, but somehow overwhelmed the late-night Border Patrol skeleton crew, who was under-resourced to counter. Assistant Chief Castañeda then turned to JTF-6 to help disrupt El Cubano's effective and efficient operation. For decades, unofficial border crossings were a normal daily practice at El Polvo. Residents from both sides of the river carried contraband like tires, furniture, goats, and even beer, dismissing any distinction of a political boundary with laws and policies. However, marijuana smuggling did occur at El Polvo and all along the border, but Redford residents didn't seem to be as involved as media outlets and law enforcement officials projected. Despite upwards to 85% of drug smuggling occurring at ports of entry, JTF-6 was summoned and landed in the quiet region of Redford, Texas. JTF-6 Marine Corporals Torres, Wheeler, Blood, and Banuelos of Team 7 would live in the desert brush for a 3-day tour starting late Saturday evening, May 17th, where surface temperatures could reach as high as 185 degrees Fahrenheit during that day. This is an actual picture of the 4 Marines. Each of the soldiers wore ghillie suits to blend in with the environment and remain undetected by potential smugglers or residents. And by the way, their mission and their presence was kept secret from the residents of Redford. They had no clue that Marines were out there in their neighborhoods, much less on the border itself. As time passed, the team observed little to no drug activity, but instead observed vehicles crossing with tires, cement, furniture, and other contraband, a long-honored tradition along the border stemming from the early 20th century. Corporals Torres and Blood complained about how rarely the Border Patrol responded to their calls. Quote, if they don't care, why do we need to be out here, end quote. Members from Team 7 expressed in later interviews that they questioned their role in the mission and felt that the reality of the situation sharply contradicted their idea of the situation and the intelligence reports they received prior, such as the claim that 75% of Redford residents were involved in the drug trade. At approximately 6 p.m. on May 20th, their last day in the field, JTF 6, Team 7, moved to a position on top of a hill to their observation point and noticed an individual on horseback traveling up the river when a herd of goats and an individual caught their attention. Corporal Banuelos radioed the information to the command post concerning the individual with the goats. According to Lance Corporal Wheeler, the individual with the goats stopped and turned in the team's direction and fired his weapon. Hernandez fired another shot, allegedly aimed at the team, and the Marines moved to higher ground to get a visual of him, where Wheeler observed Hernandez raise his weapon again, pointed towards Lance Corporal Blood. At that point, Corporal Banuelos fired one shot at Hernandez, knocking him into an empty fire pit. Wheeler stated that after the shot was fired, he saw the individual's feet come up. Banuelos, Blood, and Torres made their way to where Hernandez lay, and Banuelos then gave a verbal warning saying, quote, U.S. Marines, put your hands up and get out of the hole, end quote. When the Marines approached Hernandez, he was still breathing, but they did not move him. As a result, Hernandez bled out and expired. Wheeler stated that he received a radio transmission that the Border Patrol was on their way, arriving approximately 25 minutes after the first notification. A bullet entered Hernandez's torso beneath his right arm, destroying every organ in its path. On July 4th, 1997, Pentagon spokesman Kenneth Bacon stated the Marines acted properly and in accordance with the rules of engagement. Quote, the Marines' account is fairly explicit that they have been fired upon. The rules of engagement are very explicit that they are allowed to respond in self-defense with deadly force if necessary, end quote. Military attorney Jack Zimmerman, who represented the shooter, claimed that Hernandez, despite having no criminal history, quote, fit the profile of a drug trafficker that was given to the Marines in their training for the mission, end quote. In August 1997, a grand jury convened in Marfa to address the evidence and listen to sworn testimony. On August 14th, the grand jury refused to indict Banuelos, believing that, quote, the Marines were following the rules of engagement when they were following Hernandez to maintain visual observation until the U.S. Border Patrol arrived, acting reasonably in the defense of a third person, end quote. The United States Navy and the Justice Department would eventually settle a civil suit with the Hernandez family for $1.9 million. An officer serving in JTF-6 described the U.S.-Mexico border and the mission as challenging because, quote, when they confront someone at the border, they cannot tell if the person is an immigrant, drug smuggler, or a terrorist. However, it doesn't matter because they are reacting to a living, breathing matter that is hard to duplicate, end quote. Hernandez's murder is more than the consequence of a fatal miscalculation by the military in the JTF-6 mission. Rather, his murder is the consequence of a historical legacy that has vilified Mexican bodies in the United States. Public policy addressing immigration restriction, border security, and drug smuggling since the Cold War has consistently categorized and reinforced the Mexican nemesis caricature. From Project Candor of the Eisenhower administration, Reagan and Bush's war on drugs, and George W. Bush's war on terror, ethnic Mexicans have served as the target and consequentially denied full integration into the American mainstream. Militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border complicates the integration of people of Mexican descent into the mainstream. The case study of Hernandez's murder suggests that socio-political understanding of the border as a dangerous space lends to categorically assigning its Mexican inhabitants not just as racialized others, as I've spoken about, which has been historically suggested, but categorized as deviant and a nemesis of the United States. With a review of the 20th and 21st centuries, we can see ethnic Mexicans beyond the concept of racialized other or as an enemy of the state, argued in my first book, but rather a community emotion, therefore hardly subscribing to accepted norms of institutional racialization and or citizenship in the United States. In contrast, the state has utilized the concept of fluidity and movement characteristic to the borderlands to assert its power and categorization of the borderlands as a dangerous place. The state, despite its rigid outlook on boundaries, functions in a fluid, evolving manner along the border to justify its legitimacy and authority over the boundary and how it characterizes ethnic Mexicans and other Latinos. Political and cultural shifts play a major role in creating a flexible state apparatus that leaves many borderlanders and Latinos in constant flux. A part of my motivation in this intellectual journey is what scholar May Nagai calls alien citizenship. The paradox is that despite citizenship status and or generations of residency in the United States, certain racial and ethnic groups are perceived as forever foreign and never fully American or members of the mainstream. She specifically identifies Asian Americans and Latinos as targets of this labeling. The state succumbs to the nature of the borderlands in adjusting and evolving to achieve stabilization and authority. However, the movement of Latinos and the changing nature of the border threatens the state. The ever-changing border where the people and space are never truly fixed contradicts and disrupts the state's objective for stability. In other words, as Latinos and the borderlands contradict the rigid notions of nationhood, the state hardens the fluid nature of the borderlands to substantiate its authority and the categorization of migrants as a nemesis of the state and alien citizens. This prevents ethnic Mexicans and border residents from assuming full integration while submitting to permanent alien citizenship and as a threat to the state. The study also suggests to understand the role of the state in this ever-changing landscape. In part, authority structures police and attempt to paralyze the innate nature of the borderlands through militarization. As a result, ethnic Mexicans and Latinos are categorized as a mythical nemesis and prohibited from a socially and at times legally and politically subscribed status of belonging. All the while, ethnic Mexicans and Latinos resist both passively and overtly static notions of nationalism, citizenship, and race, thus rendering them alien or outside the mainstream. A categorization that manifests when an 18-year-old, excuse me, that manifests when an 18-year-old high school student tending to his goats is transformed by policy and a militarized border into a threatening drug dealer. Or in the case in 1991 where high school football coach and teacher Benjamin Murillo and several of his football players were stopped by a United States Border Patrol agent. The agent approached the car and pointed a pistol at the head of Coach Murillo, who was wearing his licensed high school football coaching shorts and shirt, and explained he was a football coach at the local Bowie High School in El Paso, Texas. And this is a photograph of the football stadium of Bowie High School. And just to give you some context, this is called Border Highway, and this is Juarez. So they're right up against each other. Today, there's a massive fencing that covers all this here. And this is the famous structure, the X, that was done by an artist in Mexico. He further explained 2 of his football players were in the car with him and asked the agent to holster his gun. The Border Patrol agent proceeded to search Murillo's vehicle without his consent or probable cause. In December of 1992, a federal judge found the Border Patrol guilty of violating several of the plaintiff's civil rights, and the court ruled, quote, that the illegal and abusive conduct of the El Paso Border Patrol was directed against the plaintiffs solely because of their mere immutable appearance as Hispanics, end quote. The small sampling of case studies that I have highlighted demonstrates not only the power of the state as an authority, but its transformative power as well. Moreover, the cases to various degrees exemplify the fluid nature of ethnic Mexicans and their precarious position. So what more to make of this? Understanding the interdependent nature of the borderlands lends to something bigger than intellectual curiosity about the border. I had the pleasure to run for congressional office in the 2018 election cycle and learned very quickly the value of our expertise on issues of migration, border security, international commerce, citizenship, and culture. I don't mean that my work or that of my colleagues will directly write policy, but rather inform policymakers, citizens, and the intellectual community alike. I contend that many away from the border, civilians and politicians, lack empathy for those living and crossing the border. Perhaps with an interdisciplinary and collaborative approach, we not only inform and educate, but invite everyone to feel empathy for migrants, residents, and the land at our border. Thank you.
What would you kind of say or respond to the most recent development with this busing or movement of migrants from the border to like the homes of politicians, and how that kind of challenges what the state is trying to do, and kind of like your argument, like how does that kind of
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting.
well, no, I was just thinking about how like it's obviously trying to bring, at least from what my novice understanding of it, maybe he's trying to bring the border issue to their front door to say, oh, well, you have to deal with it because we deal with it here. So yeah, how does that challenge, and obviously targeting politicians of certain political parties to say, oh, you have to deal with this?
So immigrant flows are cyclical almost. So this is not bringing attention to a new topic, right? So that in itself, that objective, if you're trying to bring attention, well, that's been here through the previous administration before that, and so forth. So one of the things that I think that when we try not to get into too much of a political discussion, what it does highlight is the resources we have to manage. That's the key word. It's not to control, and it's not to control, but to manage the border. Our resources are severely under-resourced. And that's not just because of the current administration or even the previous. It's been like that for several. And I think, and what Peter Andreas and several others would say is like that's on purpose, right? And so that's where we're getting at. So I think that, those political stunts, in large part, in my opinion, they're stunts. But if we're going to talk about it in a way that we're trying to say, okay, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that, and the funny thing is that you have a state governor who has literally no jurisdiction of the border. So it's the issue of the federal government, right? Who do and are very much aware of what's happening. They've been aware of it. It's just that you have, you don't have enough judges to have the hearings. You have very complicated situations when you have to understand our involvement with the Geneva Convention and our international laws that we have. We're welcoming refugees and so forth. We can go historically and what happened to the Jewish Germans who were denied and so forth. So those types of things. So I think that when we look at it, it's more of a fact that we continue to have an under-resourced infrastructure to manage. And the whole point is that the political rhetoric around it is not saying manage. They want to say we can control it. That's what I was saying in my paper today, is that they continue to give this sort of provide this false objective that we can control it and therefore prove our authority and our hegemony over it, and the thing is, the reality is that they can't, because you can build a fence, but they're going to go around it or go under it or go over it. Or, as most immigrants come in, they come in through the legal ports of entry. Most enter legally. When they become undocumented is when they overstay their visa. But just like the drugs, they come in through legal ports of entry, and they come in legally.
So first of all, thanks for your talk. It's been great. One thing you mentioned that I'm kind of curious about is that you mentioned, at least with the Pentagon, and I know in the last number of years, that the amount of spending on the border has increased dramatically, but you are at the same time also calling border management under-resourced. And I'm wondering if there's a way to see that as anything other than deliberate, or...
So some scholars like Andres would say it's deliberate, right? But what I think what I'm trying to get at, when you say they're not approaching, even when they do the budgeting, they're not approaching it as a management objective, right? So that's why they're going to say, we're going to increase the boots on the ground. We're going to throw money at this. And we have seen that budget, as you pointed out, increase exponentially. There was a very poignant congressional hearing with former DHS Secretary Janet Napolitano, when one of the congressional members asked her point blank, because she was saying, we need more money because we need more boots on the ground. She was asked point blank, how many is it going to take? Like, what is it going to take to secure the border? She literally had no idea. So it's like when you don't even know, because why? Because you're not, that's the wrong approach you're taking. You say, we don't necessarily need more Border Patrol. What we need is more judges to have these hearings so that people are here because they're refugees can have a legitimate status, right? But that was a really poignant thing that I discovered, is that a piece of historical evidence that she literally had no idea, and nobody ever since her has ever said it's going to take 50,000 agents, 45,000 agents. She can't say it. And if they do, they're just throwing out a number. It's kind of similar to General Westmoreland during the Vietnam War, when he was asked, like, what's it going to take? He's like, it's going to take just arbitrary numbers, right? That's kind of a tangent, but, I hope that answers your question a little bit.
It does. Thank you.
Perhaps time for one more if we have one.
There, right behind you.
Excuse me. 35 years ago, there was a book entitled Mex America, Two Countries, One Future. Do we still, how would that play out today?
It's a very good question. I like that because, of course, historically, we've been intertwined, interdependent on one another. This is more prevalent on the border region by far. However, there are examples today where Mexico is pulling away, at least when it comes to trading with the United States. This was just recently discussed in a report that, for example, their trade amount with China has increased quite significantly, right? former President Vicente Fox said, "We're not. If they want to close the border, go right ahead. We'll deal with other people. We have major partners in Europe that are not trying to shut us out." And of course, and from the U.S. perspective, Mexico still remains a major trading partner, obviously. But I think what they underestimate is not just the amount of goods that we're trading between each other, but it's the human capital that is necessary here, right? When was it in 2010, when you had some of the very draconian state laws that were anti-immigrant, one beginning in SB 1070 in Arizona, and then there was probably the worst, excuse me, forgive me for saying that. One of the more strict laws was in Georgia. And the United Farm Workers Union famously said, okay, you want American workers? And this was around the time of a little bit after the Great Recession, right? So our unemployment rate was still relatively high. They had a huge campaign, come and work and pick in Georgia's fields. They literally only had 7 people show up. And only one lasted longer than a week. And they were paying like $20 an hour, something ridiculous, that they certainly don't pay their regular workers. And they proved a point. And then, of course, they had, I think, definitely millions of dollars of loss that Georgia had recorded during that period when they couldn't find domestic workers to come out and work in the fields. So it's just still kind of persistent. So yeah, we are one future because, yeah, we are still intertwined despite the fact that we have these political differences. Probably more, I wouldn't say they've been pronounced. They've always been, complicated, right? I think if Mexico and the United States ever put their relationship status, it would say complicated, right? And it certainly is. I know that was my poor attempt as an old fart to claim social media or something like that. So I apologize to all you young students.
Well, thank you so much all for coming. Let's join
Thank
in
you
a
all.
round of
Really
applause.
appreciate
Thank
you
you
coming out
for
tonight.
Dr.
Thank you.
Levario.